Father broke horses and did construction. He painted houses, and hunted and fished. But that was for fun. I would help him. I was more of a crash test dummy. You know, when you train a horse, it's a wild animal. It doesn't necessarily like to be ridden. I was the son he never had, so it was my job to, stay on.
All right, now as you guys know, I love to start by establishing a baseline because lie detection really depends on how far we deviate from our baseline, and there are certain things that hold more or less weight depending on how often we do them. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why do we need to establish a baseline? We already did one with her deposition 6 years ago. But for me, the more recent the baseline and more situational the baseline, the better it is. First thing, this is happening a lot, and I haven't seen this in her before when she speaks. Very often at the end of her sentences or like mid-sentence, she'll stop and she'll do this thing where her lips are compressed and raised. And it often comes with that inwards breath or this sort of like a nod as she looks around. And it's happening quite a lot. Now this tight raised lips thing, which we call a mouth shrug, typically happens for one of two reasons. And the interesting thing is, in her case, I think it's actually both. It goes back and forth. The first reason is, the best way to describe it is, it's the physical way of saying, I don't know what else to tell you. So notice how sometimes you're talking and you might say something like this, and usually the shoulders go up and you look at them like, sorry, I don't know what else to tell you. So it's when we're at a loss of words. So I do believe that there are certain cases where she wants to say more, she wants to sell more of this story, but she's like, I don't know what else to add here. I don't know what else to say. The second reason this happens is shared grief or seeking pity, which is more or less the same thing. Think about any event where a bunch of people are feeling pity and sharing grief, like a funeral, for example. You might walk in and you might see someone you know and they might look at you and go like this. And there's a little bit of that, it's hard to express in words how I feel, but the reason that happens is the following. When we're sad, when we're actually grieving, our chin tenses up. And it's really hard to smile when there's tension here. It looks weird, look. Like it's really hard to do. So in that setting, when you're grieving, when you're sad, and you see someone and you want to extend a polite smile, it's really hard to actually smile. So the best we come up with most of the time is this. It's an acknowledgement and isn't this sad? So in the case of Amber, I think she's doing this as a mechanism to seek pity, to be like, I'm grieving, share this grief with me. Speaking of seeking pity, listen to the language that she's using when she describes her childhood. In that one sentence where she talks about, the things she used to do with her father, first she says, I was a crash test dummy when she talks about riding horses. Then she says, I was the son he never had. These are pity-seeking sentences, and I believe she's beginning this mechanism of seeking pity from the jury. This is something that I think has served her well throughout her life, to get sympathy from people, and I think she's throwing these lines in there to begin the sympathy-seeking process. Besides that, we're seeing a relatively calm person, not too many signs of stress here. It's just someone telling her life story, and we haven't gotten to the emotional part yet, but it's nice to know that this is her baseline.
There are certain things that you do in the job to be professional, like when you have to do that sort of scene, and you don't you don't use your tongue if you can avoid it.
Did he use his tongue?
Yes.
Okay.
That right there was, for me, the first big red flag in her testimony. Now, I don't talk about this very often, but I spent years as a therapist specializing in people who are trying to get over loss or really bad breakups. And as such, I worked with a lot of people who were in abusive relationships. In an overwhelming majority of cases, when that person spoke about how they first met or any physicality between them and their eventual abuser, you would normally see expressions that are consistent with disgust. So even thinking back to when they were physically together, you would see these cringes, you would see the nose crinkling. It's not a pleasant memory for them. It's very unlikely that she would reminisce on their first kiss, which is what she's doing in this scene, and him putting his tongue in her mouth and get all giddy and smiley and almost like she's feeling those butterflies again. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I am saying it's highly improbable. As you guys know, I rarely speak in absolutes because there are exceptions to every rule, and one of the first things we learn in behavior analysis is to consider all options. So why is she doing this? Why is she smiling this way? Well, I believe that it's because Amber Heard is on the stand to tell a story. And the way we tell stories is, as the narrative progresses, our emotions change. She is telling this story from the perspective of Amber Heard back then, who didn't know what was about to happen. She's at the beginning of her story. All right, now we're gonna jump into where the abuse actually starts and some really interesting signs that we're seeing both verbally and non-verbally.
You know, in these kind of arguments, nothing I do is working. Walking out of the room is me leaving him, walking away from me, you know, hey, where are you going? I'm talking to you. That it went from that to pulling me in by my arm, still shouting about the accusations.
I don't know if you heard it, but that right there is one of the biggest red flags for me in this entire testimony. She does something here that she's gonna do one more time later. This is huge. So listen literally to what she's saying. She's trying to describe this scenario that happens a lot where she tries to leave him. She tries to walk away from him, but listen to the words. I think she subconsciously slips up and lets us know what actually happens. Because she says, I'm walking out of the room, leaving him, walking away from me, yelling, hey, where are you going?
Walking out of the room is me leaving him, walking away from me, you know, hey, where are you going? I'm talking to you.
That doesn't make sense. If she's trying to get away from him, leaving him, I think what she's trying to say is he's running after me, but she slips up and says, walking away from me. I think for a moment, her mind just freezes and she tells us the reality, which is he was the one walking away from her. When we're being deceptive, what we call the cognitive load is overworked. Basically, what your brain has to do is a lot. Because to tell the truth, it's very simple. You remember the truth, you tell the truth. But to lie, first you have to think of every other lie you told and to try to see if what you're about to say is consistent with all that. Then you have to think of the way you're going to present the lie. Then you actually have to present the lie. Then you have to look around the room to see if your lie is being accepted. So your brain goes in hyperdrive. And every now and then we slip things out without wanting to. And immediately after she says this completely nonsensical phrase, leaving him, walking away from me, saying, hey, where are you going? Doesn't make any sense. She freezes up and we see something called speech disfluency and verbal leaks. Basically, because what's happening is I think her brain is literally slowing down. Then we see a gesture that she does more than once. She says, pulling me in, and she does a pulling action. Why is she the one pulling? Usually when we tell a story, especially one that we're reliving, we step into our own role. So if I were to tell you he grabbed my arm, I wouldn't say he grabbed my arm. I would say he grabbed my arm, or I felt this on my arm. Imagine if I tell you I was walking down the street and all of a sudden this car came at me. I wouldn't say I'm walking down the street and all of a sudden this car came at me. It doesn't make sense. It's what I'm experiencing. So why does her gesture say pulling me in? Now, there's a difference if we're saying what this person did than what I did. So we see, for example, Johnny Depp at some point say, she threw a bottle and it went by my head. It's like, here's what she did, then here's what happened. But in this case, they were both involved in that scenario. She also says this later when she talks about being pulled by the hair.
I remember in my apartment in Orange, he would grab me by the hair or he'd grab me by the arm, face, pull me into him.
She doesn't say he pulled me by the hair. She goes, pull me by the hair. Why is she taking the role of the aggressor with her gestures? That's really weird.
And I got out some of the food I was going to put together for dinner. I went upstairs. I don't know if I came back down in my nightgown at that point or if that was shortly after, but the next thing I remember is coming downstairs and looking for him.
All right, so this is her lead-in to the night in Australia, which is something they've both talked about a lot. And if you compare their two stories, it's two entirely different things. And this is her even before she gets to it. And she's sort of leading up to it, thinking about how she's going to present this. And we are seeing a massive cluster of deception. Now, clusters of deception are the ways we know when someone's likely being deceptive. We see behaviors that indicate deception all happening at the same time that deviate from their baseline. So remember, none of these behaviors mean anything alone. So if I say something, you go, oh, I do that all the time, and when I'm not lying, it doesn't matter. Because if it's just that one thing, it doesn't mean anything. You have to see them together. And second, it has to deviate from your baseline. If you do it all the time, then it's part of your baseline. So we know her baseline. We know what she looks like when she's telling a truthful story, and all these things deviate from that. So first we see a lip lick. She licks her lips, and this is something that we do because when we're stressed, our mouth dries up, and this is a way to correct that. It's also a grooming gesture. When we bring moisture to the lips, it makes us more presentable and therefore more believable. Then we see the most researched indication of deception as she touches her face, particularly around the nose. This is not only nose touching, it's also mouth blocking because her hand covers her mouth. So face touching and mouth blocking are both signs that contribute to our cluster. Again, means nothing alone. You're talking to someone, they scratch their face, it's meaningless, but within a cluster, very, very important. Then we see a lip compression, which again is consistent with withheld opinion, something we didn't want to say or something we don't want to say. We also see a ton of eye flutters, just a whole bunch. Now, this kind of is part of her baseline. There are patches where she does this a lot, but here it's crazy. She just keeps doing these eye flutters, and eye flutters is something that we do when we're having a hard time processing information. Finally, we see a giant slow blink. Her eyes close, stay closed for a second before they open. And this is something we do when we don't want to face something, when we don't want to look at something, and it often happens with deception. So all these things happening in quick succession like that, something is really stressing her about what she's saying or what she's about to say.
He would make these comments about, you know, whoring myself out, but do so in the context of me acting, you know, and he would talk about other actresses who do my role.
We are seeing something there that is going to hold a lot of weight later when she gets into the story of the alleged abuse. Let me start off by saying that I believe what she just said there has some truth to it. Because as you can see, she's not getting all worked up and trying to contort her face. She's speaking with a rather slow cadence. And also, we've seen enough to know that Johnny Depp, especially when he's been drinking, has the capacity to kind of say some crazy things. We've seen it in texts. We've seen a bit of that sort of jealousy. Look at the way she says, myself out. So she goes, you know, she pauses and we see that bit of like disgust, like she's hesitating to say this, pause. Then she says it really fast as her tone dips. Then she goes, but, and now she comes back up to move away from that statement. This cadence is very common in people who retell a story of abuse and don't want to relive it because they've made big steps to get past it, to move past it. So often when they come to that moment, you're going to see they go, slow down, hesitate. You might see a little bit of disgust as they're trying to go to this unpleasant place that they move past. And you'll see them blurt it out, almost mutter it, and then come back up as they move away from it. So it's really interesting that she does that here because at some point we stop seeing this kind of cadence, and that's really, really telling. Now, I wouldn't want you guys to take what I just said as me protecting or making excuses for Amber or me attacking Johnny. The truth of the matter is, and I think a lot of people miss this, I'm not doing either of those things. I often get comments, not just in this case, but in a lot of my videos of people saying, this person's obviously lying, that person is truthful, I could tell this person is full of it. And I don't think most people get that that's not how analysis works. If you're polarized or overly emotional and you're using nothing but your intuition, that's not analysis. In fact, a lot of research has shown that when we have formed an opinion and we use emotions and intuition, we are much, much worse at detecting deception than we think we are. So in behavior analysis, we're taught you always have to be objective and you always have to give the benefit of the doubt with each sentence. If you form an opinion and go in with that opinion, the analysis is completely worthless. So I'm not interested in comments like, obviously this and totally that. Totally, obviously doesn't exist in my world. We look for things that indicate probability, and that's all that this is. I'm not taking sides, I'm just pointing out behaviors.
you would think you would have a response, but I, as a woman, had never been hit like that. And he slaps me one more time. Hard. I wish so much he had said he was joking. Because it didn't hurt. It didn't physically hurt me. I was just sitting there on this carpet, looking at the dirty carpet, wondering how I wound up on this carpet and why I never noticed that the carpet was so filthy before, and I just didn't know what else to do. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to react.
As a woman, I had never been hit like that. That's a strange thing for her to say as a woman. What does this mean? One of two things. Either she's saying that as a girl, as when she was younger, she was slapped that hard, but I think it's more likely she's throwing that in there again to gain sympathy as a woman, like to remind them that, keep in mind that in this relationship, I'm the woman. Another thing here is a really great point by my friend Emily D. Baker, who brought this up during a live stream, and I asked her for permission to talk about it. Emily is an incredible lawyer with an incredible YouTube channel all about law. She covers a lot of legal cases. She used to be a district attorney, definitely knows what she's talking about, and she understands behavior really well. And she said that in all the cases of abuse she's ever dealt with, usually the cadence doesn't slow down and become more clear when the victim talks about abuse. It's kind of muttered and sort of said a little bit softer just to get past it because they don't want to revisit it. And I kind of alluded to that when I said that, Amber earlier talking about something else kind of did that, sort of like muttered something that he said that was verbally abusive. But it's such a great point Emily pointed out, where when she's talking about all these traumatic things, she slows down and really emphasizes it. And although it's not impossible, it's very rare to see that. Then she says it didn't hurt physically, and we're seeing a lot of this over-dramatization that a lot of people have caught. We're also seeing this sadness in her mouth start now, which is going to come up a lot during this testimony. And a lot of people have said it looks fake, but a lot of people don't realize why it looks fake. And I'm going to tell you why. The reason it looks fake is because as an actress, she knows that when we're sad, we frown. In other words, the corners of the mouth go downwards. But she doesn't understand why we frown. So she is activating the muscles of her mouth to move downwards. And she's talking like this. And she's doing a lot of this kind of thing as she talks. It starts now and gets a lot worse later. That's not the reason we frown when we're sad. When we're sad, the muscles of the face relax, and as a result, the cheeks droop downwards. And when we open our mouth, and we do open our mouth to breathe because we're feeling stressed, as a result, because the cheeks are drooping and the mouth opens, the corners of the mouth slightly go downward. It's not the muscles of the mouth, it's the muscles of the face that are causing the corners of the mouth to go down. When we try to do it with the muscles of our mouth, it looks exaggerated and out of place. Finally, at the end, she's giving a lot of detail about this dirty carpet. And she's saying, it didn't hurt physically, but I was on the floor looking at how dirty this carpet was. Well, there's a bit of a contrast there. If you're slapped hard enough to end up on the floor, it's probably going to hurt physically. And now she's giving all this detail about this carpet, and typically we say truth tellers tell, liars sell. And one of the ways they sell is to give you incredible amounts of detail about things that don't directly involve the act or the event they're talking about. So they feel that by telling you how dirty the carpet was, a part of your mind goes, oh, well, she must be honest about this whole thing because she's giving us all these details about the carpet, so this must have happened. Please keep in mind, it's very difficult for me to say what I just said and some of the things that I'm about to say. As someone who's had his heart broken by stories of abuse, someone who's dealt with victims of abuse, it's very difficult to point out inconsistencies and clusters of deception. Because remember, despite what I'm seeing, despite the signs that I'm seeing, despite the feeling that we're all getting that there's a lot of inauthenticity to this, ultimately, it's possible that there could be truth to this. And I don't want to be the person who doesn't take abuse seriously. So again, I'm not attacking this, I'm not defending this, I'm simply saying, here are the elements that for me don't add up.